The city stirred just before sunrise. The ground twisted beneath the streets. Fire chased people through the ruins.
Dawn rose gently over the Pacific, spilling a pale saffron light across the hills that cradled San Francisco. In the spring of 1906, the city was a glittering gateway to the American West, rich with ambition, layered with stories of gold rush fortunes, immigrant dreams, and the ceaseless hum of a bustling port. Streetcars clanged down Market Street, where polished brick facades caught the morning sun. Steam whistles shrieked from ferries crossing the bay, carrying commuters from Oakland and Sausalito. To a traveler arriving by ship that April, the skyline appeared as a crown of church spires, domed civic halls, and the proud silhouette of new steel-frame buildings that promised a modern age. The city had grown fast, perhaps too fast. After the gold rush of 1849, every decade brought new waves of seekers. Italians opening grocery stalls on Columbus Avenue, Irish laborers grading rail lines, Chinese carpenters shaping the very timbers of the waterfront, merchants from the Midwest building banks and hotels. By the turn of the century, nearly 400,000 souls called San Francisco home. They believed they were building a city as enduring as granite. On pleasant April mornings, the air smelled faintly of salt and eucalyptus. Flower vendors arranged tulips along Union Square. Carriages rattled past the new stone City Hall dome, one of the largest in America. Proud locals boasted that their skyline rivaled Paris or New York. Architects filled the hillsides with elaborate Victorian houses painted in pastel hues. Bay windows like watchful eyes gazing down crooked streets. The city was a jewel that had learned to look east across the continent and west across the ocean at once, confident that destiny belonged to those daring enough to build on shifting hills and sand dunes. Yet beneath the paved streets and gas-lit boulevards, the earth itself was restless. Running nearly 800 miles along California's coast lay the San Andreas Fault, a deep fracture where two tectonic plates slowly ground past each other. Residents knew the word earthquake, but mostly as a curiosity, something that rattled dishes or tilted a chimney once in a while. The last severe shock had struck in 1868 across the bay near Hayward. Memory of that destruction had faded under decades of prosperity. A handful of geologists in distant universities warned that the region's seismic peace was deceptive, but their cautions rarely reached city planners or the public. Building codes remained lax. Many structures were heavy brick resting on soft fill or reclaimed mudflats near the waterfront. Handsome to the eye, but brittle to shaking ground. Gas mains crisscrossed every block to feed the new era of modern lighting and cooking. Elevated water tanks crowned hotels and boarding houses. The system was efficient until it wasn't. Still, in the early days of April 1906, no shadow of catastrophe dimmed the city's optimism. On the docks, longshoremen stacked fragrant timber from Oregon beside bales of Australian wool. The Palace Hotel glowed at night with chandeliers of electric bulbs, a wonder to travelers. Children skated along smooth new sidewalks, and the Sunday papers carried advertisements for grand spring dances. If anyone sensed a rumble beneath their feet, they blamed passing wagons. There were small omens that only hindsight would magnify. A slight uptick in tremors recorded by observatories hundreds of miles away. Dogs barking without cause on cool nights. the subtle warping of door frames in old buildings near the waterfront. But such signs were too quiet against the clamor of progress. To understand the shock that would come, one must first stand in that bright, thriving San Francisco, the confidence in steel bridges and electric streetcars, the clang of commerce at the Embarcadero, the perfume of bakery bread drifting from Chinatown alleys. It was a city certain that the 20th century belonged to it. The people went about their lives unaware that deep under the coast ranges, forces were slowly winding the fault like a tightened spring. On the evening of April 17th, the bay reflected a silver moon. Families strolled after supper along the ferry-building promenade. Sailors sang low shanties on anchored ships. Lights of Nob Hill mansions sparkled above the dark grid of streets. Newspapers reported nothing more than ominous than debates in the state legislature. Children were tucked into bed as a westerly wind swept cool and clean from the ocean. The ground beneath their homes held its breath. In a few hours that calm would shatter. But on that final night before the upheaval, San Francisco seemed immortal. Its ornate facades, its bustling depots, its diverse neighborhoods, all humming with the promise of a grander tomorrow. The city slept, trusting the dawn to rise as it always had.
At 5:12 a.m. on Wednesday, April 18, 1906, San Francisco was wrapped in a chilly pre-dawn stillness. A soft ocean fog drifted inland, curling around the tall masts at the wharves. Lamps still glowed in the windows of early-rising bakers and ferry crews. Most of the city's 400,000 residents slept beneath heavy quilts, dreaming untroubled dreams. Then, without warning, the ground bucked beneath them. One sharp jolt, like the city had been struck from below by a giant's fist. A low, thunder-like roar swelled up through the bedrock as the Pacific Plate lurched nearly 20 feet northward against the North American Plate. The first shock was followed by a rolling convulsion that tossed beds across rooms and tore chimneys from rooftops. Windows burst inward with the popping sound of musket fire. Horses in the stables screamed. Witnesses later described the earth heaving in waves as if the hills themselves were made of water. Rails of the Market Street cable cars twisted into serpentine curves. Brick walls split corner to corner. Stone cornices fell like guillotine blades into the streets below. Within 20 seconds, the city that had slept in peace was alive in terror. A switchman at the Southern Pacific Rail Yard remembered seeing the steel rails undulate like loose ropes. Across town, on Howard Street, an entire row of modest boarding houses pitched sideways as if nudged by an unseen hand. A milk wagon overturned, sending a white river across cobblestones already fractured into zigzag cracks. The tremors' deep rumble was drowned out by the sharp percussion of collapsing masonry. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but its violence was unmatched in local memory. Seismologists would later measure it at an estimated magnitude 7.8 on the modern Richter scale, releasing energy comparable to several thousand atomic bombs. In Chinatown, wooden tenements swayed like masts in a gale, but survived better than heavy brick hotels nearby, whose walls peeled outward to expose entire bedrooms as if a giant dollhouse had been split open. Downtown, the proud new City Hall, topped with a dome taller than the U.S. Capitol's, suffered catastrophic damage. Its sandstone facade cracked and sloughed off in sheets. Statues crashed from pedestals. At the ferry building, the clock tower lurched but somehow remained standing, frozen at the hour of the quake's fiercest convulsion. Telegraph lines snapped, silencing the city's link to the outside world in seconds. Panic surged through the streets. Families fled their homes, clutching children and bed covers, shouting names of loved ones over the din of falling bricks and neighing horses. Some residents in the south of the market district watched helplessly as the ground split beneath the streetcar tracks, spouting jets of water and sand in a phenomenon now known as soil liquefaction. Wooden sidewalks buckled into ridges. Church bells clanged madly, not by human hands, but by the quaking earth. On the waterfront, the quake jarred open the massive doors of warehouses, spilling crates of canned goods into the bay. Ships moored at the piers lurched as their gangways twisted. A few blocks inland, gas mains fractured beneath cobblestones, hissing invisible fumes into basements and cellars. The city's intricate web of infrastructure, its pride, was fatally wounded before sunrise. After the first wave of destruction came an eerie stillness. Dust clouds drifted above the skyline like a ghostly fog. The cries of the injured echoed across ruined streets. People stumbled from collapsed boarding houses, their nightclothes gray with plaster. Neighbors helped one another over jagged rubble, unaware that the danger was far from over. For nearly an hour, aftershocks rattled the city at irregular intervals, some mild, others strong enough to topple walls already loosened. Each tremor revived the primal fear that the earth might open again. Horses refused to move, and frightened dogs barked at the silent ground. Dawn finally broke through the coastal fog, revealing the full horror. Whole blocks of brick buildings reduced to heaps, with fractured water mains gushing streams that coursed uselessly down slanted gutters. Nob Hill's ornate mansions had lost their chimneys and ornate balconies. In the working-class Mission District, wooden cottages leaned drunkenly against each other for support. Telegraph Hill shed chunks of rock that tumbled down into the streets below. By mid-morning, survivors gathered in open squares, Union Square, Portsmouth Square, vacant lots near the ferry building, too afraid to return indoors. Mothers clutched infants, men searched frantically for relatives, calling out names that dissolved into sobs. A child, separated from her family, sat on the curb hugging a rag doll coated in dust, staring blankly at the rising sun over a broken skyline. Among those walking the wreckage was General Frederick Funston, commander of the Presidio garrison. Taking quick stock of the chaos, he dispatched soldiers to guard banks and warehouses and to help keep order. His presence would soon shape the city's desperate defense against the next catastrophe. But at that moment, in the first hours after the quake, San Francisco was still reeling from the violence of the earth itself. Citizens looked upon their shattered streets and believed the worst had passed. Few imagined that the coming fire would prove even more ruinous than the quake that had toppled their homes.
Not long after the sun climbed above the eastern hills, thin curls of smoke began to rise over several blocks of the city. At first, survivors thought they were looking at nothing more than dust clouds stirred up by collapsing chimneys. Then came the smell, sharp and acrid, the scent of leaking gas catching fire. The earthquake had torn open hundreds of underground gas mains, snapping valves and dislodging heavy kitchen stoves. Sparks from broken electric lines and overturned kerosene lamps found eager fuel in the wooden interiors of homes and hotels. Small blazes appeared across the city almost at once, in a boarding house kitchen on Hayes Street, in a bakery near the waterfront, in the basement of a saloon on Mission Street. The survivors who had fled their houses could only watch as orange tongues of flame licked up through shattered windows. By mid-morning, a brisk west wind blew in from the Pacific, feeding those flames with oxygen and driving them eastward toward the dense heart of downtown. The scattered blazes merged into advancing walls of fire, devouring wooden sidewalks and climbing up brick facades that had been cracked by the quake. At the Palace Hotel, one of the proudest buildings of the West, guests and staff struggled to drag trunks and luggage out to the street. Within an hour, the grand lobby, once adorned with crystal chandeliers, was a furnace of falling embers and molten glass. The fire leapt from rooftop to rooftop with unnerving speed, carried by gusts that sprayed burning shingles like autumn leaves. San Francisco's fire department faced its worst nightmare, crippled and disorganized. The quake had burst the city's main water mains, leaving hydrants dry. In many districts, firefighters who rushed to the hydrants found only a weak trickle or nothing at all. Dennis Sullivan, the city's respected fire chief, had been gravely injured when a brick chimney collapsed through the roof of his home during the quake. Leadership now fell to exhausted captains, trying to coordinate horse-drawn steam engines amid the growing panic. In desperation, crews hauled hoses to the waterfront and tried to pump bay water into the burning streets, but the equipment was too limited and the flames too fast. As the inferno swept east along Market Street, firefighters resorted to a drastic measure once used in frontier towns. They began blowing up entire rows of buildings to create fire breaks. General Frederick Funston authorized the Army to assist in these demolitions. Soldiers placed dynamite charges in warehouses and saloons ahead of the fire's path, hoping to clear a barren strip that would halt the blaze. But the hurried explosions often scattered flaming debris into adjacent rooftops, sparking new fires rather than stopping them. Still, they had no choice. The walls of flame continued their march. By afternoon, the firestorm had become a force of nature all its own. Columns of superheated air rose hundreds of feet, pulling in more wind at ground level. Witnesses described whirlwinds of sparks, fiery tornadoes that leapt across streets too wide for ordinary flames. Telegraph poles glowed like candles before toppling into the streets. Smoke turned the noonday sky a deep rust-colored twilight. On Nob Hill, the elegant Fairmont Hotel, barely completed before the quake, succumbed to the approaching inferno despite frantic efforts to save it. Mansions that had survived the quake's shaking now cracked apart in the heat, their bay windows shattering as flames roared through velvet-draped parlors. Families who had fled to higher ground found themselves encircled by advancing fires and were forced to descend toward the waterfront once again. The human tide of refugees streamed toward open spaces, Golden Gate Park to the west, the Presidio's military lawns to the north, the wide lawns of Jefferson Square. Mothers bundled children in blankets. Elderly men pushed handparts stacked with china, photographs, and whatever food they could snatch before fleeing. They passed soldiers posted at intersections to keep order, their bayonets glinting in the glow of distant flames. The city at night became a vision of hell. A correspondent for the Call Chronicle-Examiner newspaper wrote that San Francisco looked like a city built of paper set alight by a giant torch. The air was thick with drifting ash, pieces of scorched paper, old letters, account books, floated across the bay and fell like dark snow on the decks of anchored ships. From the water, sailors could see the entire downtown outlined in a jagged red halo of fire, its reflection quivering on the black waves. By the second day, Thursday, April 19, the fires had consumed much of the commercial district and leapt to the south of Market neighborhood. The exhausted firefighters and soldiers continued to dynamite blocks in a grim retreat before the flames. Refugee camps grew crowded in city squares. Makeshift soup lines appeared beside army tents.
A chilly fog rolled in overnight, but did little to dampen the heart of the city. On the third day, April 20th, the wind finally eased. Fire crews managed to halt the eastward spread of the flames near the wharves by creating wide fire breaks and pumping water directly from the bay. In other quarters, the inferno burned itself out simply because there was nothing left to consume. Charred chimneys stood like blackened tombstones over ash-covered lots. When the sun set that evening, the once proud skyline of San Francisco had been reduced to miles of smoldering rubble. More than 500 city blocks, roughly 4 square miles, lay in ruins. Survivors wandering the still hot streets described hearing the distant hiss of collapsing walls long after the main fires had died. Through those 3 days and nights, acts of courage shone amid the chaos. Firefighters worked until their boots melted from the heat. Sailors ferried hundreds of the displaced across the bay to temporary safety in Oakland. At the Presidio, military nurses tended to the burned and the homeless. Priests carried relics and parishioners alike out of collapsing churches. Doctors set up field hospitals on street corners. Yet for many residents, the memory of those nights would forever be the deafening roar of burning blocks, the red sky over the bay, and the haunting sound of dynamite echoing through the streets as their city was sacrificed piece by piece in the battle against the flames. When the final walls of flame sputtered out on the evening of April 20, a strange hush settled over San Francisco. It was not the peaceful quiet of a city at rest, but the hollow silence of streets emptied of their homes, their music, their bustling commerce. The sky hung low with a haze of fine ash, drifting like gray snow that coated the blackened frames of buildings and the twisted rails of the cable cars. In the first light of dawn on April 21, survivors emerged from camps in parks and along the waterfront to face what remained. Once busy avenues like Market Street were no longer streets at all, but corridors of rubble. The outlines of grand hotels and department stores stood only as jagged shells, facades without roofs or floors. Across 4 square miles of the city's heart, nearly every structure had been reduced to chimneys, skeletal iron beams, or heaps of brick and char. The toll of life was only beginning to be counted. Contemporary reports often understated the numbers, but historians now estimate that more than 3,000 people perished, many trapped beneath falling masonry in the first violent minute of the quake, others lost in the inferno that followed. Entire families vanished without official record, their names known only to neighbors who whispered of them around refugee campfires. In Union Square, now a tent city, women stirred thin soup over open braziers, while children sat silent, clutching whatever toys they had managed to carry through the night of flight. The U.S. Army, working with local volunteers, erected thousands of canvas shelters in Golden Gate Park and the Presidio Meadows. Despite the rough conditions, there was a fragile sense of order. Water wagons rolled between rows of tents. Priests and ministers moved quietly among the displaced, offering words of comfort, and nurses tended to the burned and fevered. The city's economic heart had stopped beating. Banks stored their rescued ledgers and coin under military guard. The Great Palace Hotel was an empty ruin of scorched brick. The Fairmont on Nob Hill, barely open to the public, stood gutted by flames. Factories and warehouses along the waterfront had collapsed or been dynamited to stop the spread of fire. Wharves that once bustled with cargo now served as temporary landing points for aid ships bringing food and blankets. Among the ruins, soldiers patrolled under strict orders to deter looters. Martial law had not been formally declared, but General Funston's troops enforced curfews and even authorized gunfire against those caught stealing. Newspaper correspondents recorded scenes of young men shot while trying to salvage liquor from a fallen saloon. Grim measures, justified at the time as necessary to maintain some semblance of control in a city teetering on chaos. As the shock subsided, grief began to seep into daily routine. Residents wandered back to the blackened lots where their homes once stood, sifting through ashes for any surviving memento, a scorched silver locket, a warped photograph, a child's cracked porcelain doll. The sight of familiar landmarks, church steeples, the dome of City Hall either toppled or hollowed out by fire, brought many to tears. Yet even in despair, small signs of resilience appeared. Refugee camps organized communal kitchens and sewing circles. Neighbors shared salvaged bread and stories around lantern light at night. Immigrant communities, Italian fishermen from North Beach, Chinese shopkeepers from Chinatown, Irish dock workers from the Embarcadero, formed their own relief committees to look after the elderly and orphaned. The city's newspapers, operating from temporary presses in makeshift sheds or even ferries anchored in the bay, resumed publishing within days, carrying front-page headlines declaring that San Francisco would rebuild. Messages of sympathy and donations of money and supplies poured in from across the nation and overseas. The catastrophe had shocked America, but it also stirred a wave of solidarity. Still, the suffering was immense. Hospitals overflowed with the injured. Illnesses spread quickly through the crowded camps as spring rains turned streets to mud. Many who had lost everything decided to leave permanently, boarding ferries eastward with no clear destination beyond relatives in the countryside or opportunities in other cities. By the end of April, nearly half of San Francisco's population was homeless, scattered between canvas camps, distant towns, or relatives' farms. Standing on the burned slope of Nob Hill at dusk, one could see all the way to the bay without obstruction. Once grand neighborhoods now flattened into a somber plain of soot. The setting sun lit the remnants of steel and stone in a dull copper glow, and the sound that lingered was the wind moaning through hollowed windows. The great city that had greeted the century with electric streetcars and glittering hotels now lay stunned beneath a mantle of ashes, its people grieving but alive, gathering strength in their camps and shelters. Out of that ruin, the first faint stirrings of resolve could already be felt, a collective determination that the city's story was not over, that from this wasteland, San Francisco would rise again.
Even as the ashes of the fires were still warm, the people of San Francisco began the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming their city. The first step was survival itself, feeding the displaced, keeping the sick alive, and restoring a sense of order where none seemed possible. In Golden Gate Park, a field of wildflowers had been transformed into a sprawling encampment of tents and lean-to shelters built from salvaged boards. Here, more than 20,000 refugees found daily rations of bread, beans, and coffee ladled from massive iron cauldrons tended by army cooks. Nearby, makeshift field hospitals under canvas cared for the wounded, men with broken limbs set in splints of scrap wood, women with burns swathed in layers of gauze, children soothed by nurses humming lullabies above the distant sound of hammering and saws. Across the park's lakes and meadows, families organized themselves into small neighborhoods by heritage and trade. Irish dockworkers pitched tents near Italian fishermen. Chinese shopkeepers built orderly rows of shelters around communal cooking fires. African American families gathered beneath the spreading eucalyptus.
At night, campfires glowed like constellations scattered beneath the fog-softened sky, a reminder that the soul of the city still flickered even in its darkest days. The Presidio grounds to the north became another vast relief camp under military supervision. Wooden signposts marked lanes between tent rows. Bulletin boards listed missing persons. A rudimentary postal service sprang up so refugees could send notes to relatives across the country. Alive, safe, in camp at Presidio, do not worry. These short lines of hope carried the spirit of endurance more than any sermon could. Church congregations, many without buildings left to worship in, pitched revival-style tents to hold Sunday services amid the encampments. Hymns drifted across the rows of tents in the cool morning air. Priests and ministers moved with lanterns at dusk, visiting the sick, listening to stories of loss, offering words of encouragement. We will rise again. The Lord has not forsaken this city. For some, faith became the only anchor against despair. The business of the city, though wounded, stirred as early as the second week after the disaster. Banks reopened from temporary offices aboard moored steamships or inside wooden sheds hastily erected on cleared lots. Merchants set up plank counters on street corners to sell salvaged goods, barrels of flour, nails, candles, fresh produce carted in from farms south of the bay. Prices fluctuated wildly at first, but a steady flow of relief funds from the federal government and private donors helped stabilize the markets. In May, the municipal authorities, backed by prominent businessmen, announced a bold pledge. San Francisco would be rebuilt not merely as it was, but grander and safer. Newspapers printed sketches of wide boulevards and earthquake-resistant steel frame buildings. This vision gave the homeless something to cling to, not just survival, but the promise of renewal. The challenge was immense. Entire districts had to be cleared of unstable ruins before reconstruction could begin. Volunteer gangs, college students, longshoremen, even former clerks worked with picks and shovels to cart away thousands of tons of brick and debris. Horse-drawn wagons formed slow processions to dump the rubble along the waterfront or use it to reinforce seawalls. Meanwhile, carpenters built rows of wooden cottages, small but sturdy, to replace tents before the damp winter returned. These earthquake cottages, as locals called them, were painted in cheerful greens and whites and arranged along newly plotted streets. For many families, receiving the key to one of these cottages was the first step towards regaining dignity after weeks in canvas shelters. Aid came from across America and beyond. Chicago sent rail cars loaded with lumber. New York shipped medical supplies and cash donations. Even distant countries like Japan and Britain wired funds and relief goods. President Theodore Roosevelt personally telegraphed assurances of federal support. These gestures reinforced the sense that San Francisco's fate mattered to the whole nation, that the tragedy had united Americans in compassion. Amid the grinding labor of reconstruction, moments of humanity persisted. A photograph taken in July showed children flying kites above a row of temporary cottages, their laughter rising above the clatter of hammers and saws. On Sundays, families gathered at outdoor markets where musicians played violins and brass horns, reminding everyone that the city's cultural heartbeat had not been silenced. Some citizens used the calamity to advocate for long overdue reforms. Engineers pushed for stricter building codes to ensure that future structures could better withstand seismic shocks. The fire department, having learned bitter lessons about crippled water mains, drafted plans for an independent high-pressure hydrant system fed from reservoirs on the surrounding hills. City planners debated straightening crooked streets and widening avenues for better traffic and firefighting access. Out of devastation grew a vision of modernization. Still, not all wounds healed quickly. Insurance disputes dragged on for months as companies argued over whether damages were caused by quake or fire. Immigrant shopkeepers who had lost their businesses often lacked paperwork to claim compensation. The working poor, especially in the south of Market District, faced years of hardship before they could recover their livelihoods. Yet, despite frustrations and bureaucratic delays, the general will to restore San Francisco never faltered. By the autumn of 1906, whole blocks of new wooden storefronts were already rising from cleared lots, painted bright white against the charcoal gray ruins still waiting demolition nearby. Ferry traffic across the bay returned to near normal volume as trade resumed. Schools reopened in temporary halls, with their teachers improvising with salvaged chalkboards and benches. Visitors arriving by steamer were astonished to find not a city crushed beyond hope, but one humming with hammers and bustling with determination. They saw in the ruins not just loss, but opportunity, the rare chance to remake a city for a new century. In these months of hard rebuilding, San Francisco's diverse citizens, immigrants, merchants, laborers, soldiers, the wealthy and the poor, discovered a common purpose. They worked side by side to clear the wreckage, to pitch new roofs, to feed the hungry, and to rekindle the pulse of commerce and culture. This unity would become the foundation of the city's renewed identity. The catastrophe had tested their endurance no enemy ever had. And yet, from the charred stones and ashes, hope had taken root, stubborn as the wild poppies blooming again along the park trails. In time, that hope would flower into steel bridges, grand boulevards, and a reputation for resilience that would define San Francisco for generations to come.
By the spring of 1907, a year after the Great Disaster, the streets of San Francisco rang once again with the clang of streetcars and the cries of newspaper hawkers. The wounds of the earthquake and fire were still visible in vacant lots and scorched building frames, yet everywhere there was motion, a surge of scaffolding, the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the sight of iron beams swinging from cranes. The city had refused to lie in ruins. The leadership that emerged in those crucial months after the disaster proved decisive. Business magnates, civic officials, and engineers joined hands with labor unions and immigrant committees. Meetings often took place in temporary wooden shacks lit by kerosene lamps, where plans for new boulevards, stronger bridges, and public transit lines were sketched on salvaged drafting tables. The shared trauma of the quake and fire had stripped away many old rivalries. For a time, at least, the ambition to rebuild outweighed politics. One of the most symbolic achievements was the construction of the new ferry-building plaza, cleaned, repaired, and reopened as the beating heart of bay commerce. Markets returned with baskets of fresh produce, fishermen from the wharves sold their morning catch, and ferries again disgorged thousands of commuters each dawn. Nearby, banks that had conducted business from ship decks during the crisis now stood behind brick and steel walls, reinforced to withstand future shocks. The promise to rebuild grander and safer slowly took visible shape. Architects experimented with steel frame skyscrapers capable of flexing with seismic tremors. Civic leaders championed a comprehensive fire suppression system. High-pressure hydrants supplied by new reservoirs in Twin Peaks and Ashbury Heights. For the first time, the city invested heavily in scientific studies of the San Andreas Fault, urging that knowledge, not mere optimism, should guide the next generation of construction. Yet the recovery was not only of bricks and mortar, it was also a restoration of civic spirit. In refugee cottages that had once lined Golden Gate Park, neighbors formed lasting bonds, carrying the camaraderie of shared hardship into the life of their rebuilt neighborhoods.
Churches and temples, rebuilt with donations from across the nation, became centers of both worship and community organizing. School children returned to lessons, sometimes in tents at first, then in sturdy new classrooms where teachers used the disaster itself as a history lesson about perseverance. By 1910, the skyline had begun to change. Steel and concrete buildings rose where flimsy brick blocks had fallen. Hotels reopened with electric elevators and ornate ballrooms. Theaters once again staged operas and vaudeville, restoring a sense of normalcy to evening streets. At the edge of the bay, warehouses bustled with the export of California wine, fruit, and manufactured goods. Visitors who had last seen the city in ashes now marveled at a metropolis apparently reborn. The spirit of renewal culminated in 1915 with the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a World's Fair held to celebrate both the completion of the Panama Canal and the astonishing recovery of San Francisco. Gleaming palaces of fine arts, exhibition halls, and broad esplanades spread across a former marshland on the northern waterfront. Millions attended from around the globe, walking beneath triumphal arches and electric lights that glittered against the bay's evening mist. For many residents, the exposition felt like a collective victory parade, proof that their city had not only survived, but had reclaimed its stature on the world stage. Behind this public triumph, however, lay hard-won lessons. City engineers drafted the first rigorous seismic building codes for the West Coast. Civic planners emphasized wider streets and open plazas that could serve as fire breaks in future emergencies. The fire department built a dedicated auxiliary water system, high-pressure mains, pumping stations, and cisterns, designed explicitly to prevent a repeat of 1906's crippling water shortages. Hospitals improved their disaster wards, and civil authorities formalized emergency response plans. On a more human level, the tragedy had reshaped the city's identity. Communities that once lived in separate enclaves, Irish dockworkers, Italian fishermen, Chinese merchants, Jewish shopkeepers, had shared bread, shelter, and grief in the camps. That experience planted a sense of mutual dependence that persisted long after the tents were gone. While prejudice and inequity did not vanish, the bonds formed in crisis softened many divisions and broadened civic pride. Writers and artists captured the transformation in poems, sketches, and early newsreel films, often portraying the city as a phoenix rising from ashes. One journalist described walking at dawn along the rebuilt Market Street, remembering the charred silence of 1906 and hearing now the rhythmic clang of cable cars as the heartbeat of a city resurrected. The catastrophe also left an imprint on the national consciousness. Across the United States, the San Francisco earthquake and fire spurred interest in seismology, emergency relief protocols, and insurance reform. States with active fault lines began to reconsider building practices. Charitable organizations, having learned coordination during the disaster, evolved into more professional national networks that would respond to later calamities. On a more human level, the tragedy had remained vivid decades later. The roar of collapsing walls at dawn, the red sky at midnight, the weeks spent in canvas shelters, and the hum of hammers that heralded rebirth. Grandparents told these stories to children as cautionary tales and as proud reminders of what endurance could achieve. Walking today through the streets of San Francisco, past the ferry building's steadfast clock tower, across Union Square's bustling shops, up the hills where Victorians once again preside, one can still sense echoes of that era. Brass plaques on certain buildings commemorate their survival or their reconstruction after 1906. The city's distinctive mixture of beauty and resilience owes much to that crucible of fire and stone. The earthquake and fire of 1906 remain among the greatest natural disasters in American history. Yet, beyond the staggering loss, it left a legacy of resilience and innovation that shaped not only a city's skyline, but also its civic soul. In the story of San Francisco, the tragedy stands not merely as a warning of nature's might, but as enduring evidence of human determination. The Pacific fog still drifts over the Golden Gate each morning, as it did more than a century ago. But beneath that mist lies a city rebuilt on deeper knowledge and shared memory. The lessons of 1906 about preparedness, solidarity, and the will to rebuild continue to guide its people through future challenges, natural or man-made. And so, as dusk paints the hills of the city in gold once again, San Francisco stands not as a monument to what was lost, but as a testament to what can be regained when a community refuses to surrender.